They say courage isn't about size, it's about what you're willing to risk when everyone's watching and the odds are stacked against you. Hollywood, May 13th, 1960. The Moulin Rouge nightclub on Sunset Boulevard, a charity ball and Western-themed costume party. The biggest stars in Hollywood dressed as cowboys and saloon girls, drinking champagne and pretending the world outside didn't exist. But in the back of that crowded room, two men were about to have a confrontation that would become legend. One was John Wayne, 6'4", 220 pounds, dressed as a cowboy naturally, the undisputed king of American cinema, the symbol of white masculine power. The other was Frank Sinatra, 5'7", 150 pounds, dressed as a Native American woman, complete with wig, headband, and a single white feather, and he was furious. What happened in the next 10 minutes wasn't just a fight between two drunk celebrities, it was a clash of ideologies, a battle between old Hollywood and new, between conformity and rebellion, between the man who represented everything America claimed to be and the man who dared to question it. This is the untold story of the night Frank Sinatra, dressed as a native woman, stood up to John Wayne in front of hundreds of witnesses, and what he said next left the Duke speechless and reminded everyone in that room that power isn't measured in inches or pounds. It's measured in the courage to speak when silence would be easier. Los Angeles, May 13th, 1960. 9 p.m. The Moulin Rouge nightclub was already packed. Hollywood's elite had come out for a charity benefit and costume party with a Western theme. Cowboys, saloon girls, gunslingers, bank robbers, everyone playing dress-up, everyone playing pretend. Frank Sinatra arrived late as usual, but when he walked in, people stopped talking. He was dressed as a Native American woman, not a generic Indian costume, a deliberate, detailed representation, a long dark wig with braids, traditional dress, a headband with a single white feather standing upright, war paint on his cheeks. Some people laughed nervously, others whispered, a few understood immediately. This wasn't just a costume, this was a statement. Frank's assistant, a young man named Tony, walked beside him, concerned. "Boss, you sure about this?" Frank adjusted his headband. "Absolutely. People are gonna talk. Let him talk. That's the point." Tony knew better than to argue. He'd been working for Frank long enough to recognize when his boss was in a fighting mood. And tonight Frank Sinatra was ready for war. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand what had happened in the weeks before. Frank had been planning to produce and direct a film called The Execution of Private Slovik, based on the true story of the only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. He'd hired Albert Maltz, a brilliant screenwriter, to write the script. The problem: Maltz had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era. He was labeled a communist sympathizer, and when news broke that Frank Sinatra had hired him, Hollywood exploded. The pressure came from everywhere: studio executives, politicians, conservative groups, and most publicly from John Wayne. Wayne had gone on record calling Frank's decision unfortunate and suggesting that hiring a blacklisted writer was un-American. His comments had been quoted in every newspaper from Los Angeles to New York. The Duke, as always, positioned himself as the moral authority of Hollywood. Frank had fought back. He'd defended Maltz publicly. He'd argued for artistic freedom. He'd stood his ground. But eventually the pressure became too much. Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, had personally called Frank and made it clear fire Maltz or the Kennedys would distance themselves from Sinatra forever. Frank had backed down. He'd fired Maltz, and it had destroyed him. Not financially, not career-wise, but morally. Frank felt like he'd betrayed his principles. He'd let fear win, and the man who'd pushed him over the edge, who'd made the loudest noise, who'd used his massive public platform to shame Frank into submission, was John Wayne. So when Frank heard that Wayne would be at the charity ball, he'd made a decision. If this was a Western-themed party, and Wayne was going to come as the Cowboy King, then Frank would come as something else. Someone the Cowboys had tried to erase from history. He would come as the people Wayne's characters had spent decades killing on screen. The evening progressed. There was dinner, dancing, a musical program. Wayne performed Red River Valley, his deep voice rumbling through the room, every inch the authentic cowboy. People applauded warmly. Then it was Frank's turn. He took the stage in his Native American woman costume, and the room went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, the uncomfortable kind. Frank picked up the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to sing a little number for you tonight. It's called The Lady is a Tramp." He began to sing, but this wasn't the smooth romantic Sinatra everyone knew. This was aggressive, defiant, every lyric loaded with subtext. "I get too hungry for dinner at 8. I like the theater but never come late. I never bother with people I hate. That's why the lady is a tramp." People in the audience understood. Frank was singing about himself, about refusing to play by the rules, about despising the people who'd forced him to fire Maltz. As Frank sang, he saw Wayne in the audience. The Duke was sitting at a front table, stone-faced, arms crossed. Their eyes met. Frank didn't look away. When the song ended, Frank walked off stage without acknowledging the applause. He headed straight for the bar. Wayne watched him go, and something in the Duke's expression said this wasn't over. The party continued until well after midnight. By 2 a.m., most guests were drunk and heading for the exits. Frank, still in his costume, was standing near the door saying goodbyes when he saw Wayne making his way through the crowd. The Duke was impossible to miss. 6'4", wearing full cowboy regalia, 10-gallon hat, neckerchief, boots with spurs that clinked with every step. Frank made a decision. Instead of avoiding him, he walked directly into Wayne's path. They came face to face, David and Goliath in costume. The room seemed to sense the tension. Conversations stopped. People turned to watch. Wayne spoke first. His voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Frankie, what the hell did you walk away from me for?" Frank looked up at him. 12 inches of height difference, 70 pounds. But Frank didn't back down. "You cried, Duke. You blasted off your mouth. You mean the Maltz thing?" Wayne's voice had an edge now. "Yeah, the Maltz thing." The crowd around them had formed a circle, everyone watching, waiting. Wayne stepped closer, intimidating with his size. "I said what I believed. That's called having principles." Frank's voice came out cold. "No, that's called being a bully. You used your power to destroy a man's career, and you used your platform to pressure me into doing something I didn't want to do." "I was protecting America," Wayne said. Frank laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Protecting America? From what? A screenwriter? You're so scared of ideas that you'd rather destroy people than let them work." Wayne's face reddened. "Maltz is a communist. Maltz is a writer." Frank shot back. "A damn good one. And you couldn't stand that I was giving him a chance because it threatened your narrow little worldview." The tension was electric. Wayne took another step forward. Now he was towering over Frank, using his size to intimidate. "Watch yourself, Frankie." Frank didn't move, didn't step back, just looked up at Wayne with absolute defiance. "Or what? Duke, you gonna hit me? In front of all these people? That's how you solve problems? With your fists?" Someone in the crowd gasped. Wayne's jaw clenched. "I don't need to hit you. Everyone already knows you backed down. You fired Maltz. You proved you don't have the spine to stand by your convictions. That was the line. That was the moment Frank's control snapped. He stepped even closer to Wayne. Now they were inches apart. Frank had to crane his neck to look up, but his voice carried through the entire room. You want to know why I'm dressed like this tonight, Duke? Wayne didn't answer. I'm dressed as the people your characters have been murdering on screen for 30 years. The people you've turned into props and villains. The people whose land was stolen, whose culture was erased, whose voices were silenced. Frank's voice was getting louder now, more passionate. You come to these parties dressed as a cowboy and everyone cheers, because you're the hero. You're America. But I'm dressed as the people America pretended didn't matter. The people who were here first. The people who were destroyed so men like you could play cowboys. Wayne's face was red. That's different, is it? Frank challenged. Because from where I'm standing, what you did to Maltz is exactly the same thing. You silenced him. You used your power to erase him, because his ideas threatened you. Just like Native Americans threatened the cowboys. Just like anyone who thinks differently threatens the Duke. The room was dead silent. Everyone watching Frank Sinatra, 5'7", dressed as a native woman, calling out John Wayne in front of Hollywood's elite. Wayne tried to respond. You're drunk, Frankie. Maybe, Frank said, but I'm not wrong, and you know it. That's why you're so angry right now. Because I'm saying out loud what everyone in this room already knows, that you're not the hero you play on screen. You're just a man who uses his size and his fame to bully people into submission. Wayne's hand moved. He shoved Frank, not hard, but enough to make him stumble back a step. The crowd gasped again. People started moving forward to intervene. Frank steadied himself. For a moment it looked like he might shove back. His fists clenched, but then something changed in his expression. He smiled, not a happy smile, a knowing smile. That's it, Duke. Show everyone who you really are. The big tough cowboy who solves problems with violence. Real heroic. Wayne raised his finger pointing at Frank. You better watch your mouth. Why? Frank asked. What are you gonna do? You've already done your worst. You pressured me. You got me to fire Maltz. You won. So why are you still so angry? Wayne didn't have an answer. Frank stepped forward again, back into Wayne's space. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. I'll tell you why. Because you know that even though I fired him, even though I backed down, I'm still standing here calling you out. You couldn't break me, Duke. You tried. You used every bit of power you had. But here I am, in this costume, making you look at what you really are. Wayne's voice came out as a growl. And what's that? Frank looked him straight in the eye. A relic, a symbol of everything that's dying in this country. The racism, the fear, the need to silence anyone who thinks differently. You're the past, Duke, and I'm the future, and it terrifies you. For a long moment, Wayne just stared at Frank. The entire room held its breath. Then Wayne turned and walked away, didn't say another word, just pushed through the crowd and headed for the exit. Frank stood there, watching him go, his white feather bobbing slightly. As he turned to look at the crowd around him, no one knew what to say. Finally Frank adjusted his headband and walked calmly toward the exit himself. The next day newspapers from Los Angeles to New York ran the story. Sinatra and Wayne in altercation at charity ball. Most of them focused on the absurdity of the costumes, the native woman and the cowboy, the size difference, the drunken shoving, but they missed the real story. Frank Sinatra had done something that night that few people in Hollywood had ever done. He'd stood up to John Wayne, not with fists, not with size, but with words, with courage, with the willingness to say what needed to be said, even when it was easier to stay silent. Years later, in a 1975 interview, Frank was asked about that night. Do you regret the confrontation? Frank thought for a moment. No, I regret firing more. I regret letting fear control my decisions.
But confronting Wayne, that's one of the proudest moments of my life. Why? Because I stopped being afraid. For years guys like Wayne controlled Hollywood by fear. If you didn't think the right way, if you didn't say the right things, they'd destroy you. And I'd played along. But that night, dressed as someone the cowboys tried to erase, I said no. I said, you don't get to bully me anymore. You don't get to decide what's American and what isn't. What do you think Wayne thought about it? Frank smiled. I think he was shocked. I think he'd spent his whole life using his size and his persona to intimidate people, and for the first time someone didn't back down. Someone looked him in the eye and told him the truth, and he didn't know what to do with that. John Wayne never publicly spoke about the incident, but people close to him said he was deeply shaken by it, not because Frank had embarrassed him, but because Frank had forced him to confront questions he'd spent his career avoiding. Frank Sinatra and John Wayne never became friends. They existed in different worlds, different ideologies, different visions of what America should be. But after that night there was a grudging respect. Wayne never criticized Frank publicly again, and Frank never backed down from his principles again. The costume Frank wore that night became symbolic. Years later, historians and cultural critics would point to it as one of the earliest examples of a major Hollywood star using performance and symbolism to challenge systemic racism and erasure. Frank wasn't perfect. His activism was complicated. His personal life was messy. But on May 13, 1960, dressed as a Native American woman, he stood 5'7" in front of a 6'4" symbol of white American power and refused to be silenced. And sometimes that's what courage looks like. Not a fight, not violence, just the willingness to speak truth to power when everyone's watching, and the consequences are real. Frank Sinatra died in 1998. John Wayne had died in 1979, but the story of their confrontation lived on. A reminder that the most important battles aren't always won by the biggest person in the room. They're won by the one brave enough to stand their ground, even when they're outnumbered, even when they're outnumbered, even when they're outsized, even when they're dressed as the people history tried to forget.